in today's marketplace. Really, as a way of level setting, let's just talk about why we should care. What is value creation in today's marketplace? If you go back in time to Hi, and welcome to HCMI's Human Capital Analytics Training. This is part of our foundational course. It's part of our larger Human Capital Analytics Training, as well as other training certification programs that we offer, including Green Belt and Black Belt training programs. My name's Jeff, and I'll be guiding you through a lot of this training material, but more about my background in a few minutes. We're really glad you're here. We're going to be covering just some basic introductory elements about analytics, business case for analytics, and then actually getting some input from you as well. Again, as I said, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you further on the training, and also hope you enjoy all of the downloadable content, some of the exercises and links, and even quizzes and polls that we'll be conducting. Looking forward to the process. Welcome to the journey. All right, let's go ahead and get started with our foundation module. So we've got some basic introductions that we need to do. So without further ado, let's get into them. Let's talk a little bit about HCMI. So who and what is HCMI? HCMI is short for Human Capital Management Institute, which is why we often bringing numbers to people, quantifying the value and the impact. In fact, of Human Capital Management Institute do a great job with analytics, predictive, like standards to understand driven decision making that they really need to be able to do to make smart talent decisions. So in terms of training outcomes and goals, we've got a number of things. So we just want to cover in this foundational modules, what we really hope to cover is what are some of the basic imperatives? Should we care, and why now? Also, what are some of the steps and milestones along the journey that you can expect? And just give you a foundational set of knowledge in terms of the types of metrics, the types of methodologies that are used, and the importance of things like standards to understand talent, as well as to be able to measure talent across the talent management life cycle. So if you think of that circle from additional attraction, recruiting, onboarding through retention, as opposed to turnover, hopefully people stay and continue to actually expand their cycle, expand their circle of knowledge, expertise, and value add to the organization. And lastly, we're going to walk through some steps in terms of actually building a business case, which is really important to get the resources that HR and organizations need in order to do a great job with analytics, predictive, documentary, other forms, as well as workforce planning, and getting into some of the prescriptive analytics hopefully as well. So with that said, we've got 5 sections we're going to cover today in our initial course training, and we've got some additional sections that we'll be covering tomorrow. Also, as we cover the material, what we'll be doing is calling out some of the downloadable content, some of the links, some of the opportunities for questions in terms of polls and feedback from you, because the more we know about the pain points that you have, the better we can actually tailor responses, input, and exercises for you. And you'll see how those work as we go through our training materials. So we're going to start with just some basic foundational. We're going to get into a little bit of standards. We're going to talk about something that we think is really, really critical to getting the attention of C-suite management, particularly CFOs, CEOs, Chief Operating Officers, or COOs, which is workforce productivity. And then lastly today, we're going to be talking about human capital analytics and the talent management life cycle. So what are some of the key metrics and some stories that you can use to help build your business case, but also gain a better understanding of what some of the world's best companies have done in terms of building their own metrics and analytics journey. So lastly, what we'd like to talk about is some reading materials. Now, there's an enormous list of reading material out there, and it's been expanding at a very rapid rate. However, what we've got for you is some of the, best stories that are out there, some of the greatest hits type stories. So some of them are a little bit older, some of them are newer. A couple that I would call out initially would be Moneyball, which was made into a movie that was nominated for Academy Award, which is all about using analytics to help a very low-budget baseball team, the Oakland A's, actually build a winning team that could actually get to championships, which, by the way, they have been very, very consistent in having tremendously winning seasons and actually getting to the playoffs year after year with a budget that's only a fraction of what some of the larger budget teams have. Another one is called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and that actually talks about using data to tell stories, and really in many cases very entertaining and educational stories around hockey players, around birth dates, around naming of children. Some really interesting stories. So if you're looking for a couple of books that are great page turners but also give you a little bit of background and education about analytics and metrics, that would be Moneyball and Outliers. There are also quite a number of other books out there. Nate Silver's The Signal and the Noise, which is how to strain out all of the data and filter it down to what really matters. And then also a lot of other stories, many of them by Jack Vitsenz, who's an advisor to HCMI and a longtime friend of mine, and is really the founder or the creator of metrics and analytics as a space in HR. So with that, we hope we give you a little bit of a start or a little bit of a taste, some teasers, if you will, about what's to come. So that's section opening, and we're going to pause for just a moment as we go into our next section. All right, so this is section 1. Let's go ahead and dive into this section. And this is really about a business case for analytics and workforce planning. So we'll talk a lot about analytics and planning. By the way, we see those as two rooms of the same house. We'll show you what we mean in a few minutes. So in terms of summary learning points, you can see what those are, and I'm not going to repeat them all because you can read it just as well yourself. But the idea is to set a stage and create a business case or an imperative for analytics, which is all about getting the resources that organizations need to be able to do good analytics and have the metrics, have the predictive analytics, have the resources and the tools and the staff to actually enable this level of solutioning, because it's not something that is easy. If it was easy, everyone would already have it. Everyone would already be a master. So we'll also talk about some links and maybe even a quick case study or two and some of the other downloadable content that you can take advantage of. The majority of the value of a company's market value, basically their stock price times their shares outstanding, was basically linked or linkable to what would be called physical assets on their books. So if you talk about what's on the balance sheet of a company's financial statements, the positive side in assets, what you're talking about is land, inventory, equipment, other kinds of both tangible and intangible assets, maybe inventory. So all of these things actually accounted for a significant amount of the market value of a typical company. So for example, what you see is the components of the S&P 500, which is a conglomeration of many different industries, top 500 companies in the marketplace. So what has changed dramatically is what used to be a very small percentage, only 17% of the market value companies in 1975, couldn't really be explained by physical assets on the books. Fast forward to 2015 and beyond, and now what was the tail has become the dog. Now, 84% of what is market value in a company cannot be explained by physical assets on the books. And to perhaps understand that a little better, all you really have to do is think about an iceberg. So think about the majority of the iceberg is under the water. So what you see is only a small piece. Some examples of such market value differentiation could be many of the tech companies today, the Googles, the Amazon, actually Facebook. Really, you're talking about social media companies with huge valuations, and what justifies that? Certainly not physical assets, inventory, and things that they own. In fact, in many cases, they don't even bother to buy their buildings. They lease them because they can utilize their resources and value elsewhere, which, by the way, for them, their primary source of value is talent. So what we're saying is that the majority of that market value is actually linked to human capital. It's linked to what's called intangible capital, which is primarily created or derived from and by people, both those who are at the organization and perhaps those who came before, who helped build the systems, build the processes, build the brand, build the customer service levels, build the culture. That really drives a lot of the value, and that all links to human capital, which is all about what we're trying to measure. So again, think of the iceberg. You can also think of physical assets and physical equipment, and that's really where the market is not going today. The majority of the market value, particularly if you pick on the highest valued or valuation companies today, are not about equipment, cash, land, and inventory, although some companies like Google have so much cash and so much value that they don't really know where to hide it. So they do end up often buying land because they've got nothing else to do with all of that money they have. What's some of the intangible value? Well, you're really talking about patents, copyrights, brand value. But by the way, what creates a copyright? What creates a patent? What creates brand value? People, talent, human capital. So actually, we would say that everything intangible capital in terms of origin is either directly a result of the efforts of the current employees or the value that's been created by those who perhaps came there before or created it in prior years. An example is actually Tesla versus Ford. So interestingly, the Ford actually decided very recently to withdraw from all auto manufacturing. They're going to focus on light trucks and crossover vehicles versus Tesla, which is building primarily fully electric automobiles or passenger cars. So one actually makes over 100,000 cars a year, the other makes millions of cars a year, and yet Tesla, with manufacturing only 100,000 cars a year, actually has a higher market value than does Ford. How can you possibly explain that with traditional valuation methodologies? Well, what a lot of conservative accountants might say is that the market's crazy, but really, is it? In fact, if Tesla represents the future and they're able to dramatically ramp up their production, what is really being valued is future prospects, also the ability to innovate and cross over borders to solve complex problems, which, by the way, one could argue Tesla has actually, even with their manufacturing problems, done a better job of than Ford with its more than 100-year history, particularly looking at who's being the innovator and who's making the greatest inroads in terms of electric cars and hybrids. So that closes out this section, which is workforce analytics, definition and evolution of analytics, which is where we're going to be going next. So why don't we dive into that? What is workforce analytics? So we've talked about it a little bit, but what is it? Well, you actually see a definition here. And the real issue with analytics is not trying to define it. Analytics is really using data to make decisions about anything. So in this case, workforce analytics would be using data to make decisions about people or talent. A lot of other specialty areas and functional groups have been using essentially analytics for a long time. Finance and accounting, one can argue, is all about analytics, but you're really talking about the very, very lowest level of analytics, which is basically just reporting on what's happened in the past. So you're talking about historical reporting. That is a form of analytics, but it's what's called descriptive statistics. Very, very basic. It's not predictive in terms of the future. What we really want, when we say analytics, what most organizations really are thinking about is that predictive element. And statistics has been using elements of that. Marketing has been using elements of that. Finance, as we said, have been using elements of that. Even so is manufacturing in many cases. So many other functions of an organization or a typical business have used advanced analytics for a long time. HR has traditionally lagged a bit behind. So if you look at the history or the development of analytics, specifically workforce analytics, so analytics around talent, around the workforce, they really have lagged behind. Statistics is several hundred years old. Marketing research has been able to do amazing things in terms of predicting consumer behavior and actually marketing consumer brands, products, and building value from a brand standpoint. And then you look at finance theory, which is actually using portfolio theory and using finance projections, so building net present value, making projections out into the future to actually value companies, which, by the way, is what I used to do in my prior life. And today, HR is really finally starting to catch up. There's been a lot of data, and actually the proliferation of the web, the internet, SaaS, software as a service, has actually created a huge explosion in data about people and talent. So today, many organizations are actually arguably almost drowning in people data and talent data. They just need to be able to put it together in the right way to make it work and get value out of it. So in the future, we actually see human capital data as being just as valuable and just as essential to business decision making as finance data is today. And sadly, speaking as a former CFO with the hat on, and also as an HR analytics professional and former HR practitioner, HR is not quite there yet, but they are catching up. So in terms of levels, As I mentioned, in terms of analytics, almost anything you do in reporting, so most organizations today are reporting only three things: joiners, which is new hires; staff strength, which might be their headcount reporting; and then leavers, which would be your turnover or termination reporting. Those are the three basics that most HR organizations are actually reporting on. Unfortunately, that's anything but prescriptive, anything but predictive. And if you ever wondered why business leaders aren't actually relying more on HR, it's because that basic level of reporting, it's important, but it's extremely foundational. It's really about taking that data, which is good raw material, and building something much more valuable out of it, which is what we call predictive analytics. So as you might be able to see, there's a number of different ways and tools that you can use to make predictions. Statistics is great at coming up with predictions. So linear regression is a great way to use data and make a prediction. Trend analysis is a really simplistic way. If you've got multiple years of data, you're seeing the data going down or the data going up in terms of metrics, and there are ways to normalize metrics so that you can compare them and benchmark them. That can actually get a little bit predictive. But then even higher up is what we call multivariate statistical modeling, which is using a series of variables to try to predict as much of the potential or probability that an outcome is going to happen as possible. And then beyond that is another element called workforce planning. So once you know all about an organization, you can actually model a future workforce. What if we did this with cost? What if we did this with recruiting? What if we did this with our training and development? Or we did some programs that would improve employee engagement? What might we get in other areas? And actually some of the algorithms that HCMI uses in its software include all of the different metrics of the talent management lifecycle to create evaluation. So if you change one thing, there's a ripple or a cascade effect across all other metrics. So you can see that value created. And actually some of the basic models you're going to get in this training program will help you see a little bit of that. And then lastly, once you achieve what we call level 2 or predictive analytics, there's another level, and that's what everyone really wants. Nirvana is really prescriptive. Now that we know how to predict it, or basically what drives it, what drives more of it and what drives less of it, now we can create a prescription, like going to the doctor who writes you a prescription when you're ill. We know what the treatment is to hopefully get more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. More of the good stuff being something like higher levels of engagement, higher levels of performance and productivity, better training programs that add more value to workforce, and less might be less turnover, fewer sick days, things like that. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to achieve. We want to move up that scale from level 1, which is descriptive, reporting about what happened and very boring usually, to predictive to prescriptive. Another way to think of it, there's actually 4 levels in Berson's or Gartner's levels setting document, which is really descriptive, prescriptive, predictive, it's descriptive, diagnostic, which is getting into the why, predictive, and prescriptive at the very top. So the diagnostic is an added level which talks about why. So if you're doing what's called root cause analysis, and you can drill down into your data, and a lot of databases enable you to do that, you can go from the basic what to the why, which often can be part of the solution, and yet you still need to be able to make a prediction. Know that if we make a change, or we improve that metric or that data by 10%, what are we likely to get out of it? Which, by the way, Business Case 101, that's what business leaders are always going to ask you. If you improve this metric by 10%, what does the business get? If the answer is I don't know or nothing, then you kind of take 5 steps back in terms of your business case and your effectiveness and your credibility. And that's what we want to avoid, is having the answers to the problems and questions that you know are going to come from having additional metrics and making those initial predictions. Ideally, all the way to prescriptive. So the next section is going to be challenges in measuring human capital. So we'll pause here for just a moment. And now, challenges in measuring human capital. If this were easy, everyone would already have it mastered. So obviously it is not easy. It is not simple. One of the evils I guess we would confess to, I would certainly confess to, is we are going to present this a little bit as if you just follow all these steps, you'll be there, which is all true. And yet we don't want to make it sound like it's too simple. This is a little bit of, you have to overcome a number of challenges around data integration, cleansing, building that business case, which we're going to step through and talk about. But again, it is a challenging journey for many organizations to make. Some make it very quickly. Most take several years to actually get really, really good at it. So why bother with human capital reporting? In terms of building a business case or why we should really care, what might be interesting for many of you that either have been in the space for a while or are new to it to know is that ISO, the International Standard Setting Organization, is actually coming out with a standard for what's called human capital reporting this fall being in 2018. The goal or the ideal there has been a 2.5 year, now almost 3-year journey to actually identify what are the metrics that across many industries, many organizations, that would be the most impactful and the most important for constituents and institutional investors to know. So we're talking about what would be called public reporting of human capital metrics, which today, particularly in the US, but in many markets around the world, very, very little talent, aka people, aka human capital data, is actually required to be disclosed. In fact, in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission only requires the disclosure of how many employees you have. Nothing else. And for most organizations that are very large and publicly traded, that's all they disclose. Some do choose to disclose more. So more and more organizations are doing what's called CSR reporting, corporate sustainability reporting, or they're issuing a separate sustainability report, or they're issuing something else in terms of their impact on the environment, so environmental reporting. So all of that is all good, and in some cases those organizations are including a little bit more data about their people and their talent, because those are really the ones who are actually investing or actually making the environmental improvements, the social improvements, and governmental improvements, including ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. However, in terms of ISO's reporting, what they've identified is about 20-odd metrics which are going to be required for all large organizations, typically that are publicly traded, to actually disclose in one report or another as part of their public disclosure. Further, about 75 to 80 metrics will actually be recommended for private reporting, meaning these are the kinds of metrics that organizations large and small would benefit immensely from having and measuring. But today, without all of that, there's really like a lack of standards in HR, a lack of standards in terms of reporting, and a gap in terms of knowledge and understanding, particularly for those that are institutional investors. Institutional investors arguably very strongly dislike the fact that there's so little disclosure about the talent and how well organizations, particularly top management, is building and evolving and treating their talent. Are they really building talent for the future to be more competitive, more innovative, to move faster, improve service, and be better? Or are they just kind of burning through talent, churning it, and just hiring more to replace, treating it as a completely disposable asset as opposed to something that actually appreciates in value over time? So really, that is some of the things that are happening. And so in this fall, a number of these metrics are going to be coming out. This reporting format is going to be coming out, and that could be a massive game changer over the coming years. Also, a number of institutional investors have actually petitioned governmental bodies for a greater level of human capital reporting and disclosure. There's a group called the HCM Group, or Human Capital Management Group of Institutional Investors, with about $3 trillion in assets under management, which actually petitioned the US SEC for formalized human capital reporting requirements. So all ISO standards are voluntary, although some countries adopt them immediately. What these institutional investors are actually asking for is formalized metric standards that all public listed companies, both in the US exchanges and globally, would need to actually report on. So this is a reason why every organization should care, in particular those that are larger and public listed. Another thing that's important to know, and I mentioned it a couple of times already, is that if this were easy, everyone would be good at it. So if it's hard, how can we get a better understanding of why it's hard, how it's hard? Well, the challenge of measuring human capital can actually boil down to something as simple as the diamond. Look at this slide, which shows the diamond. This is a way to show or represent the challenge of measuring human capital. So what we found is something else that exists in nature, which is very much like human capital. and that is the diamond. Why is that? Well, HR would often say, and has said many times to myself and my colleagues, that people are very complex, people are unique, people are extremely difficult to measure, all of which we agree with. The last one they often say, people can't be measured effectively, that one we disagree with. Why? Because of the diamond. So look at the graphic in the diamond, and what you see is a representation of HR metrics across all of the facets of the diamond. So much like the 4 C's, cut, color, carats, and clarity, diamonds can be effectively measured, except guess what? Diamonds are all unique. No 2 diamonds in the world are exactly alike, just like people. Also, diamonds are very multifaceted, very complex, just like people. Does that mean diamonds can't be measured? Not at all. With the 4 C's, and my friends would often jokingly say in finance there's a 5th C, cost, which is often considered the most important. Those 5 C's you can very accurately measure and value a diamond, and that's what most people use. And in fact, gem dealers, do they have additional metrics that are kind of go a bit deeper? Yes, they do. But you can go a long way with just a few metrics, knowing how to capture the complexity of the diamond. Are we trying to measure the atomic weight of the flaws inside the diamond? No, not at all. What we're really trying to do is come up with what are the metrics that best cover the facets and the complexity that is the diamond. And just like talent, as we've shown in the graphic, you can see we've taken a lot of HR metric type elements, whether they're transactional or financial or operational, and put them on the diamond to show how this relates. Additionally, this complexity is also compounded by the fact that HR has a lack of standards. And part of that lack of standards can be addressed by some of the creation of ISO standards we talked about previously. Also, HCMI has its own human capital metrics handbook, the world's most comprehensive guide to HR metrics, with over 620 metrics available on it. We also have an online version called Solve Metrics, which is even easier to use than the physical book because it will, in addition to letting you use online lookup, it will also make recommendations about other metrics that you might be interested in. Additionally, there's a frequency of change. Organizations and management are often constantly experimenting with the org chart, trying to figure out what's the right structure, what's the right organizational structure, layers, levels, leadership, formation, to unlock greater value in the organization. So that constant change, as well as transfers, hires, and terms, all of that is a challenge. In fact, I once worked for an organization where we were all the HR leadership. I was an HR practitioner. We were all called up to the CEO's office, and we were asked by the CEO why the HR reporting for headcount didn't match the finance reporting. And in sort of a moment of frustration, the CEO said, "I can't believe you guys didn't get this right," meaning HR. "I could count the employees better than you can, HR," which was sort of a frustrated comment. And nobody in the room said anything at the time. But really, if I were there today, I would say, okay, great, let's do this as a hypothetical. If people are so easy to count, let's empty everyone from all of our buildings, put them in the parking lot. We'll get a podium for you as CEO, and you can count the employees. But we've got to make it realistic, right? So what we do is we'll have employees from one side of the parking lot coming in. Those are new hires. We have to have a cutoff for those, which is a clean line for when we count them and when we don't. On the other side of the parking lot, we'll have people leaving or moving off. So we also have to have a cutoff for those who left and what was their final date, both of which are manageable. And then in the middle, we'll have people moving around, standing for a bit, and then moving somewhere, and then moving somewhere else, and then moving yet again. Why? Because the organization is constantly reorganizing, in addition to promotions, transfers, and hires, and all of the other transactions that are happening at an employee level. They're often restructuring also. So all of that adds a lot of complexity. And then in the very back of the parking lot, you'll see some people standing there with their hands by their side, smiling nicely, very happy. You can't count them. Why? Because they're actually out on leave. They're being paid by the organization. So they show up in payroll numbers, which is why finance's headcount reporting can actually be wrong if you're trying to measure what is my actual physical workforce, because you're often paying, in some cases, for a sizable percentage of your workforce who's actually not there. They're out on leave of one kind or another. And so if you're really trying to understand what is my workforce actually there on site doing productive work, it can be actually as much as, in some cases, 70% of the workforce instead of 100% that shows up in payroll. So it can be as much as 30% reduction in terms of people out on leave, which is dramatic. So all of that would lead the CEO to say, oh, wow, this is actually really difficult because I'm trying to count people as they move. I'm trying to count new people moving in, people moving out, and all of this is structuring all at the same time. Yes, that's why many organizations struggle to know even exactly how many people they have. In fact, most public listed companies actually list approximately how many employees they have. They've given up on trying to get the exact number. And oh, by the way, we didn't even mention contingent workers and temps. So why else analytics? Well, another one would be a competitive imperative. For organizations that are using analytics, they're actually getting 2x, 3x, 5x improvements in terms of speed of decision making, product innovation, hiring, paying, retaining the best talent versus those that aren't. So arguably, those that are really, really the best at it don't want you to know that they're actually using analytics, which is often why it's hard to get companies to go on record with some of their case studies around predictive analytics and prescriptive solutions that they've identified. Some do, but most don't. Most consider it actually a competitive advantage. So that gives us to a pause. Okay, identifying key workforce questions. Look, many times we're asked, where do we start? How do we get going with this? We've got a ton of data. In fact, maybe we're even drowning in all of that data. Where do we go? How do we start? Well, the best way to start that we found time and again is with business questions or HR/workforce questions that link to business results. What does that mean? Well, CEOs have a lot of questions that in many organizations are going unanswered for years, sometimes decades. So a few examples of how much of our workforce is going to retire over the next 3 to 5 years. Well, organizations can make a guess, but typically they're often afraid to do that. What's the best source of hires? Where are we getting our best talent? And why do people leave? What's driving the reason why people leave? Is it something that we're doing or something we're not doing? And also, what's the right size and cost of workforce for our business? How can we increase our workforce productivity? In fact, if anything, CEOs might be asking, is our workforce getting more productive or not? And for the most part, CFOs, believe it or not, struggle to answer any of those questions. And in most cases, we'll actually toss it HR. HR often thinking, is that really our job to actually tell you whether workforce productivity is improving or not? Well, let me help you with that one. Yes, it is. Because who are the talent arbitrageurs? Who are the stewards, the guides for the human capital evolution, the journey, the career path, everything HR and talent in the organization? It's really HR. So no one is really better suited or has better data to answer these questions than does HR. And if you can add a business impact to it, meaning how much is it worth to the business? How much is it going to help save? And by the way, I'm not just focusing on profit. It can be nonprofit. It can be governmental organizations as well. It can be NGOs. It can be all kinds of organizations, because why? Everyone struggles for budget. Everyone has limited resources. There are a few organizations, actually none, that have unlimited resources. There are a few who seemingly have unlimited resources, but they don't have enough budget to go around. And so everyone would love to hire, regardless of whether they're for-profit or non-profit, one worker who can do the work of three. So let's talk about some examples. If we're trying to pitch to CFOs and finance people, what might be useful is actually to give them some examples, because by the way, as a former CFO, that's what I would have asked. So this whole analytics thing, can you tell me how much money can we generate? What kind of value does this have to the organization and the business? So what you see on the slide are a number of examples or pots of gold that exist all around the talent management lifecycle that an organization can grab or achieve. The number one being a 15% productivity gain in reduced loss rate. By reduced loss rate, I mean attrition, I mean lost customers, I mean absenteeism, sick days, even accidents. We'll talk more about that case study in a little bit. And this is a Fortune 50 transportation company, one of the world's largest organizations with over 400,000 employees. You also see a reduction in what's called total cost of workforce, or TCOW. We like T-cow because it's total cost of workforce. Or you can think of a cow with a big T on the side if you prefer. Also sales training. So what kind of training is predictive of future success in terms of sales performance and often retention of salespeople? Predictive hires in terms of sales metrics or other kinds of metrics. What is it that predicts a successful employee, whether they're an accountant, a compliance officer, or a salesperson, or a manufacturing director? Employee engagement and its linkage to revenue impact. What is the value? As I said before, if you can improve employee engagement by 10%, what is it worth to the business? So everyone often wants to improve their employee engagement, but they don't know what the outcome or the value is. If you know what that value output is for a 10% improvement, you actually can help make a better business case for how to make investments or experiments or pilot projects that would help improve that engagement. Voluntary turnover reduction. How can we lower our voluntary, which is often a proxy for regrettable turnover, meaning the turnover that we would prefer not to have. Often the people that we least wanted to have leave voluntarily, meaning it's their choice. And then ROI of internal versus external hires. Where are we getting our best people? And can we build or buy? Or is it even renting in some cases, using contingent labor via contract or temporary, a best source of hire? And the answers can vary depending on different job levels, but the idea would be that one, have the answers, and two, be able to value that. So you see some examples of the kinds of ROI you can get. And these are by no means the limit of our case studies. We actually have quite a lot of downloadable content that you can get in terms of case studies that we're going to cover in the training, and much more in depth in a downloadable document that you can reference. And we'll reference some of those as we specifically go through case studies in this training program. Now we have an exercise. This is where we need your input. So it's time for you to actually take a look at a downloadable material that we have, a downloadable piece of content called 25 Key Human Capital Questions. We would like you to go through and actually fill in what are the top 5 questions that you think for your organization are the most important to have answered. By the way, if you tell us what your top 5 questions are, we could probably tell you what metrics you should be measuring and how to potentially construct a future scorecard to better measure, manage, and answer those questions on an ongoing basis. So building a business case for analytics is really the essence. Once you know what the questions are, you're often ready to make your business case. In fact, if we talk about what's on this slide, which is what to include in a business case, and by the way, there's actually some referenceable articles that we have on our website that you can download that will actually give you much more in-depth answers to each of these items in the what to include in a business case. And there's a 6th item which has actually been added more recently called risk, which is how to use risk in terms of loss as another factor. So it starts with questions. Remember, we were just talking about picking one of the top 5 or top 25 key human capital questions. So if you have the right questions, and by the way, a great way to often start a business case is to be in a room with a lot of management and ask a question for which you know no one in the room has the answer. And in terms of the opposite of always asking questions that you know the answer to, ask a question that no one in the room has an answer to. And in some organizations, that's enough to launch a project. That's enough to get resources. That's enough to get a decision. Management will say, wow, that's an important question. We really need an answer to that. Let's go find out. And then you, as an HR or an analytics professional, depending on where you roll up, actually could say, that's great. We need this data, we need these resources, and we need these tools to be able to answer that question. And then we can get the answer for you. That's where it starts. Having an important question. By the way, That's a business type question. Don't just use HR language in it. Next would be objective measures and facts. Get some data, get some facts, and actually use visuals. Once you have that data, ideally trended, put it in some sort of a chart. In a perfect world, you do it all in one chart. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3, but the idea is to have a compelling chart. And this is kind of an unfair line in terms of item 3, which is charts that give insight. Insight's not too difficult. Tells a story a little bit more difficult, and then the last bar is really high, drives action. The best charts, actually, when management looks at that for a minute or two, gets a couple of their questions or gets oriented to it, they actually are ready to make a decision and make some movement about some issue, which is exactly what you would hope for from the right kind of chart. Then number 4 is qualitative storytelling. By the way, when I was a CFO, that's what HR did really well. They would come to me looking for resources, either staff or systems or training programs, and they would have a great story. Unfortunately, if they didn't have 1, 2, and 3 before that, then I wasn't going to give them any money based on a qualitative story. Because what does finance need? Numbers. What did HR not bring to the table? Numbers. So it's sort of the old joke, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. HR was coming unarmed, meaning didn't have good data, didn't have good facts for their business case. They did have a great story. However, let's turn it around. If you have number 1, 2, and 3, and then number 5, which is if you have an ROI, a projected savings, a projected improvement in a critical metric and how much it's worth to the organization or business, whether for-profit or non-profit, meaning better management of costs, meaning improved productivity and output, meaning improved employee engagement, lower attrition. If you have that documented and you can value it, now they're ready to hear the qualitative story. In fact, that often, using Malcolm Gladwell language in another of his books, might be the tipping point. So you have 1, 2, 3, and 4, you've got the data, you've got the questions, you've got the chart, and you've got the ROI. Now they're ready to hear the story that, in fact, the top salespeople didn't come from the sales source that most of the organization prefers to hire when they do their recruiting. They actually came through employee referral or some other kind of hiring source. Oh, there we go. Now we can potentially get a change in the way the organization recruits for sales staff. And lots of other examples we'll be talking about as well. So components of a business case. We talked about the key 5, and by the way, remember, as I said, there's actually downloadable content in terms of articles that go much more in depth in terms of what to include in every one of those 5 elements, whether you have to do a full write-up for a request for money or you're making a PowerPoint-style presentation pitch. And part of that is having that business need or imperative, which, by the way, links to either a hypothesis you're trying to address or a question you're trying to answer, linking it back to the prior. Risks. So for some organizations, having 1 through 5 on the prior slide is not enough. You have to tell them what happens if they do nothing. That in fact, the platform is burning, the ship is sinking. So they've got to get there by making some change. In other words, if the attrition rate is going up, and in today's economy, spring of 2018, it's a very hot economy. Attrition rates are going up in many industries. In fact, our generic prediction is that whomever we're talking to, your attrition rate is probably bound to go up. Why? Because it's a hot economy and there's a lot of open jobs out there and a lot of people who have options. And in fact, statistically, many would say, including ourselves at HCMI, that the number 1 correlative factor across many industries, not always the top, but one of the top, is the business and economic growth. And so since global economy is improving in almost every area of the world, and in particular the US or North American economy is very strong, that's a problem from an attrition standpoint. Quantitative analysis, you need to be able to measure what's the problem, what's the solution? And again, back to that, if we can improve it by 10%, reduce attrition, or improve engagement by 10%, by the way, if we improve engagement, our attrition rate might actually go down for us. So we get a twofer. We improve our engagement and we get lower attrition rate. And then the next area, or next element might be actually getting into the project. And you know when you get asked these questions that management is starting to lean in towards potentially giving you the resources or approving your business cases, which is what they're doing when they're asking about what kind of resources you need, what kind of timing, how long would it take, and what's your process. So if you've got answers for all of that, or you're ready to get the answers quickly, you may be close to getting approval for your business case. And in this case, when we're often talking to HR professionals or people who are linked to other parts of the business in analytics and struggling to get budget for the human capital or the talent workforce analytics piece, this is really a critical imperative for success, because if you can't get the resources, you often can't get the results. So lastly, what we really want to know is how can we quantify all of this? So one more example on risk. So even when you do everything right, some organizations are so conservative that they need to be, so to speak, scared into action. And in fact, what you often see today in commercials and other things is they tell you what happens if you don't act. So in this case, what you see on the slide is actually a sample from an actual client case study that listed the kinds of issues that they would face if they didn't act. So high turnover business impact risk. So this is a retail organization. Well, if they didn't fix their attrition issue, they would never be able to improve the level of service. Why? Because when you have a huge level of turnover in an organization, you're constantly retraining, you're constantly hiring and replacing and retraining people on the basics. You can't take the service level up to a higher level unless you're somehow able to hire more experienced people, which, by the way, many organizations in retail don't pay enough to do that. So they get themselves in literally a gerbil wheel of turnover, which you can run a business on that, but you can't optimize a business on that. Next would be attracting key talent risk. Once you have a reputation for being a bit of a churn engine with lots of turnover, not just in your frontline retail staff, but in many other types of positions, whether it's sales, logistics, other parts of the organization, it becomes harder to attract people. The world's getting smaller. There are a lot of organizations like Glassdoor where people can go online and see what your reputation is, and if your reputation is taking some hits, it's going to get harder to attract talent. So attracting key talent becomes an increasingly important risk, and it's actually related to item 1. Next is stagnant productivity risk. What if actually you're doing the same thing over and over, hoping for a better result, aka definition of insanity? You're not going to be able to improve your costs. You're not going to be able to improve productivity until you fundamentally change the way you're doing things. So what we think is talent, human capital, workforce, is a key ingredient for actually dramatically improving workforce and overall business productivity. And then lastly is leadership and development risk. If you're not developing your leaders and you have leaders that are, so to speak, just good enough, they get over the bar, you can't really eliminate them, but they do just good enough, you're really going to perpetuate the other 3 issues. And in fact, that's one of the things that many top leaders fear the most, is leaders that are just good enough but not doing anything extra. How can we either train them, motivate them to actually get more done, to have a bigger impact? And in fact, some of the case studies that we're going to talk about will illustrate some of the factors that really help that happen. This sample analytics case study that we're showing you here actually highlights some of the questions, so a very, very short version of key human capital questions. And this was actually used in a pitch for a sales organization to say, what if we could identify, and it was pitched as a what if. What if the organization, via analytics, so you see some dollar signs, could figure out who to hire, what training works and what training doesn't work, so that you don't waste the salespeople time having them go through a lot of training, most of which doesn't work, but some does. Who are the most effective sales leaders, and by how much? How much difference does a great sales leader make? Is it 2%, 20%, or 200%? By the way, the answer might even be 2,000%. But you need to be able to quantify that for your organization and culture before you can move on. And what are the drivers of turnover, performance, and engagement? Is it something that we're doing once people get here, or is it just the raw material, the candidates and the people that we're bringing in, interviewing, and hiring? And by the way, once you've answered those 4 questions, now you're ready for the workforce planning elements, which are, wow, now that we know where to get the best and how to train them and retain them, how many do we really need? By the way, it might have been fewer than what you needed before. You've now raised the productivity of your whole sales workforce, and you're actually doing it with less people. Yes, you can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can hire better people that actually may even cost less in some ways, or they're earning more in terms of commission because they're delivering more work, and actually they're able to get to productivity longer, and they tend to stay longer and be, so to speak, happier or more engaged at work. So where do we get the best talent? How can we get them to productivity faster? Those are the real value add questions, but you've got to answer kind of the questions in number 1 before you can get to number 2. So that brings us to the end of section 1, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We've got some summary learning points for you. I'm not going to reiterate all the learning points, they're really here for you, but some of them might be showing up in a quiz or a poll coming up for you next. Thank you. Okay, in section 2, introduction to analytics and case study examples. Probably there's no better way to learn analytics than to look at examples of what other organizations have done and a little bit of how they've done it. So as we start to dive into some of these case studies, what I would encourage you to do, check out the summary learning points that we're going to cover here. But in addition to that, with each case study, ask yourself, what metric or metrics did that organization use, and how did they use them to answer a business question or to provide value to the organization that enabled them to get traction, decision making, sometimes even drive the strategy of the organization overall. So that, by the way, that's one of the best, most effective ways to know that you're doing great analytics, metrics, predictive, prescriptive, even descriptive at the basic level, is if the business will take those and use them to integrate into their strategy. They'll project them out in multiple years. They'll start to use them as something that they consider reportable all the way up to the top of the business. One of the success metrics we use for one of the case studies you're going to see is what metrics are actually reported outside of HR all the way up to CEO or board level. So there's a test for you and your organization with some of your metrics. And by the way, that's one level, but then two, are they using it in some form of decision making in terms of definition of success or failure, allocation of resources, that sort of thing. In terms of analytics, the art and science, because it really is a blend of science in terms of data analysis, data integration, but art, because there's still a lot of interpretation, especially when you get a series of metrics together to interpret it in terms of a story. And nothing is better than having a lot of domain expertise, meaning having depth of experience in HR, having depth of knowledge in your business, having depth of knowledge in your culture, to be able to better quantify and understand and interpret that story. So one of the things that we're showing here, you see a small version of what we'd call the yellow brick road, or the story, which, by the way, the short answer to that story is that the analytics story or analytics journey on the yellow brick road is not a straight line. That's part of why it takes more time. This is all about identifying and investigating workforce challenges and trends, identifying is it a good trend or a bad trend, trying to find something that business leaders may not even know about and bring it to their attention, hopefully with a prescriptive solution. That makes you a truly strategic partner. You're finding problems, even fixing them before they even know that it's happened. Building a roadmap, so in other words, knowing where you are in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and fixing or addressing those shortcomings over time. And then being able to focus on a business strategy or link whatever questions you're doing to achievement in terms of success metrics, in terms of overall business strategy. We'll show you some great examples of that coming up. And then linking it, as I've said a few times, linking it to financial outcomes. In fact, we're going to hit that many, many times over and over, because that is truly the way to make sure that business leaders understand the message you're delivering, is to tell them how much it's worth or what it's costing. All right, the art and science of analytics. Really, is there a source? Is there a structure? Is there a specific type of analysis or a specific type of insight? Yes to all of the above. But, and I hate to give the consultative answer, it depends. So the methods and the tools can change a little bit depending on what questions you're trying to answer. So you like the graphics? So do I. The power of combining data sources. So we're actually going to tell a story about this one coming up in a little bit. The idea of having data science and analysis, which is actually according to McKinsey & Company, one of the fastest growing skill sets in the world and most in demand in the marketplace today, according to Indeed.com, is to have the skills and arguably the tool set, because a lot of data scientists today are coming out of school with a better set of analysis toolkit or tools and skills than ever used to exist. So many of them are coming out deep knowledge of statistics, deep knowledge of data mining, data, what's called wrangling, how to integrate, cleanse, and standardize data, how to load data in terms of what we call ETL, extract, transform, and load, transformative methods, other kinds of contextual analytics, and ideally, how to be able to storytell with the data, to figure out what data really matters in terms of separating signal and noise. So how do we do that? What do we do that? Well, really the art is the translator. So that's the challenging one. So the good news is that today most universities have data programs in data science or data analytics. Many are calling it business analytics. Some aspect of that is typically guaranteed, or is typically allocated towards human resources or workforce analytics, because, by the way, the hunt in terms of search for productivity in business analytics often leads right back to the workforce. So the two are very closely connected. But the real challenge is translation, being able to storytell to and take all the data, take all that information and some of the insights, the correlation, the predictive model, and interpret it to basically see the music in the data, is what I would like to say. And so translators, in many ways, is even more of an in-demand skill set than is the pure data science, because a lot of organizations are taking a very IT-centric, let's get a bigger, more powerful database, let's get a bigger, powerful engine, let's automate as much of this as we can, let's be able to quantify quadrillions of transactions per second. But if you can't interpret and tell a story from the data and what it's really telling you, don't really know what drives success, what predicts success, and what predicts failure or lower performance, then no matter what kind of tools or horsepower you've built, you're really not going to see the results. In no place is that more true than in talent or human capital analytics. So that's why there's really a need for a translator. What's a translator? A translator is someone who knows enough about data and analytics, but really, really knows the business, has the in-depth knowledge of the specific function. So someone perhaps with deep HR expertise who knows the organization's culture and history. And so they can also look and put on sort of their unbiased analysis hat. So they don't have to be an expert in all forms of analysis, but they do need to know great information, great insight, and success when they see it. And that's often the biggest challenge today. So case study. Let's talk to you about a specific case study for success. Starbucks. So Starbucks actually took what's called a Moneyball approach to workforce strategy. So if you think of Moneyball, that's the book that was written, one of the best sellers in terms of human capital analytics. And actually, it was a story about a baseball team and how to be successful with a low-cost budget, low-budget baseball team, the Oakland A's. So the story there, after reading Moneyball, a lot of the management at Starbucks actually said, we need to come up with our own metric for success. By the way, spoiler alert for the book Moneyball, the biggest success metric that was in the book was called on-base percentage, which was only a slight change from what's been used or what baseball had measured for over 100 years as a success metric called batting average. The change was on-base percentage meant it didn't matter whether you got a hit or how you got on base, but what percentage of the time when you got up to bat did you get on base. The one difference between batting average and on-base percentage, walks. So for those of you who don't know anything about baseball, if the pitcher when you're batting, throws 4 pitches that are outside the strike zone and you don't swing, then you get a walk. You get to go to base for free. You don't have to actually hit the ball. But baseball being kind of a macho sport in its history, actually wanted to only measure the hits, again, from a macho standpoint. But in the end, how do you score runs? How do you win games? Getting on base. Doesn't matter how you get on base. So using the rules to maximum effect to optimize your performance. So what did the Oakland A's do? Basically, the Oakland A's got players who had really good eyesight and had good discipline, so they didn't swing at bad pitches. So they either hit the ball or they walked. So they actually got on base more. They were able to score more runs. They won more games, and that's what got them, and still today, gets them into the playoffs more consistently than any other team. So after reading Moneyball, leaders really came up with, Moneyball, it shouldn't just be a project. It should be our approach to driving future decision making. Meaning, it should actually influence our strategy for how we actually deliver our service and our product, coffee, to customers. So what did Starbucks come up with? They actually gathered a lot of data, studied a lot of metrics, and actually worked with an outside partner, which is where I became aware of and was involved in the situation, and actually studied a lot of different metrics. So they were trying to say, what is it that really drives success at Starbucks? And what they were really trying to understand is what drives our partners, meaning employees, in terms of satisfaction, what drives their retention, what drives ultimately store level success, and is there anything that minimizes things like turnover rate or absenteeism? So they were looking at a lot of different data sources, and you can actually see some of them highlighted here. But the most important elements that they actually came up with were around the experience, perceptions, behavior, and outcomes. And again, remember, it has to link to business outcomes. If you get a great metric, but you can't link it to what the impact of the business is, you probably haven't found what you think you might have found. You may be using what's called a little information bias. So ultimately, what they did is they used engagement data, a number of other surveys, as well as what we call core HR data about people who are promoted, people who stay with the organization, people who are hired with the organization, and some measurement around leaders. And what did they come up with? Well, some very interesting things. So they found a number of key findings and impacts, and there's actually much more to the story than is listed here. But they found 4 variables that had a direct impact on store-level financials, meaning outcomes. Number 1, the partners, read employees' engagement or connection to the coffee company, Starbucks, the average workforce tenure, the average store manager stability, and satisfaction with pay. Now, quick question for you. Which of those is the farthest upstream? So think of analytics often as sort of like being an explorer, and you're trying to find the source of the river. You're trying to go to the root cause. Where does great performance come from? Where does mediocre or average performance come in to play? Because typically the source is going to be very pure, and that's where your optimal solutions will come from. So if you think about those 4 metrics, which one is the farthest upstream, the most predictive? Which one would be more likely to influence the others? So this is where a quick quiz or test for you could come in. I'll give you the answer in a second, and it's actually store manager stability. Because if you look at things like satisfaction with pay, average workforce tenure, and connection to Starbucks, which of those is influenced by the others? Well, they're all a direct result or influenced heavily by the store manager or the store management team per se. So someone's more likely to be satisfied with their pay if they're treated well and highly engaged. They're more likely to also stay and to be more connected with the organization and the company itself, because the direct representative of the company is actually the store leadership or the store manager. So what they actually identified is in the optimal performance in a store, a Starbucks store, was achieved by having the store management team, meaning supervisors and store manager, in place for approximately 2 years. They minimized what's called wastage and spoilage. They optimized store performance from a financial standpoint and customer satisfaction standpoint, which we all care about. And I'm a gold card carrying Starbucks member, so I should know. And also they minimized things like attrition, absenteeism, everything else. So they got more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. Before this study, what they had actually done is they often took store supervisors and promoted them to store managers fairly quickly. This was in the heady days of rapid growth for Starbucks. And what they decided, or what they learned, is that they needed to keep the teams together a little longer, aka about 2 years, to optimize that store performance. And the reason was because through that optimized performance, they were also giving the team more time to gel and readying the supervisors to replicate that culture in the new stores. So by promoting or transferring them to new stores and giving them the promotional opportunities, store performance was optimized both at the old store and the new store. Whereas when they had promoted more quickly, oftentimes the old store, losing one of the leadership team, would kind of lose their balance and start to struggle, and the new store would not reach optimal performance either. So there are other factors that also had a hand in this, but these are some of the major ones. And so the store management one is the one that really drove the tenure, drove the stability, drove the satisfaction with pay, all of that. Now, actually Starbucks, subsequent to the study, has actually done quite a number of things, including offering full tuition reimbursement assistance to employees that meet certain requirements, and a number of other things. So they've continued their analytics journey. We would argue that Starbucks is one of the world's most analytics savvy and advanced analytic practitioner companies in terms of the retail industry in the world. You can actually see the results that they achieved here. Now, obviously, we don't show the exact dollar figures, but I can tell you for sure it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That actually what you see is as customer satisfaction scores went up, so did what they call compensation or comparable same-store sales. So when customer satisfaction scores went up, people are more likely to be repeat business customers. They're more likely to recommend or refer others, which is what somebody who's kind of a net promoter, who's really high on a product would do. And that all led to higher same-store sales year over year. So basically, and by the way, the horizontal metric is really about low, medium, and high performance in terms of employee scores. So the employee engagement scores, as you can see, the employee engagement scores particularly focused on the left, it actually shows you that the higher the employee engagement, the higher customer satisfaction, which led to the higher sales. So a lot of revenue that you can drive and a lot of business impact can come out of something as simple as employee engagement, which was driven, remember, root cause all the way upstream to the source of the river, by manager or store manager stability, which meant not just store manager, but the supervisory team. So now let's talk about another section called the maturity model, which is where are we in our curve? We earlier suggested starting with questions. So focusing on some of the key human capital questions is a good way to frame. By the way, some organizations literally use the key human capital questions, which is downloadable content, as a survey to survey inside HR or to survey top management across the organization. You can then get consensus on what are the issues or questions that need to be focused on and answered first. But we're also often asked, after that, subsequent to that, what else does it take? So what are the stepping stones for having a great analytics program? So what you see here, obviously not going to read all these stepping stones, but you see them in order of process or flow. What I will talk about just very quickly is that A plus B equals C. What does that mean? That basically means that knowledge of your business and having a compelling business case, which we were talking about in the previous section, will typically lead to resources which can drive the whole process. Most organizations tend to skip over that a little bit, which is not a good way to do it, and try to focus on let's just get the right systems and data, metrics, and analytics. And so they try to build that the last step, which is the one with most of the building blocks required so that they can bridge the gap and show that ROI and connect business strategy to talent and human capital strategy. But you can't really pole vault over this. You need to build the steps. And you can see there's a lot of partnership in here. There's a need for champions. Oftentimes you want to do things on a pilot basis to prove that you can do it on a small scale before you try to do it on an enterprise scale. And many of these principles apply across industries universally. There are also some unique factors in different industries, but many of these you can use to build your process and literally check the box. How are we doing on this? Do we have it or don't we have it? In terms of a maturity model, HCMI uses what's called the ACE model. Awareness, action, competence, not just compliance, effectiveness, and excellence. So the bar does get steeper as you move up. And the idea is to get to effectiveness or excellence. So on the other side of the, so to speak, the wall, the competence wall, is really the advanced analytics, the ROI, the business impact, the strategic partner aspect of it. Most organizations today are in the action or competence stage. Those that aren't doing a whole lot yet are taking some action. In fact, by virtue of taking this training, you are taking action. So let's talk about what those components are. And in fact, there's an assessment that we'd like you to take. This is downloadable content. Please take a moment and download this and complete your own self-assessment, and we'll help you analyze and interpret your results. Okay, so once you've completed your assessment and you've gotten your score, your results, what we'd say is in the questions that you have in the survey, and this is a semi-quantitative, you can also see there's a qualitative aspect to it. So even multiple people from the same organization may get different scores, and that's by design, not by accident. And we actually want you to score yourself on kind of the yellow belt to black belt scale. So we have yellow belt and orange belt are more at the beginning elements. Getting a little more, so entering the competence phase is the green belt and blue belt. And once you get to brown belt, that's when you're over the bar and you're into effectiveness and black belt. And if you're black belt, we'd love to talk to you because we'd like to hear your case study example. Typically, if you think you're a black belt, you should have at least one big success that led to some significant ROI, a change in business output, outcomes, or strategic direction for the business. So if you've got that kind of thing, we'd love to hear from you in terms of your case study. We're happy to post it on here, either with your name or without. So how many of you are actually brown belt or black belt? Typically, by virtue of taking this training, you're not there yet. In which case, and by the way, most organizations with self-rate in the green belt, number 2 is probably blue belt. So most organizations are on the journey. They're trying. Some are a little bit earlier maybe, or they're being a little bit hard on themselves. They might grade themselves all the way down to orange belt. We very, very rarely see anyone rating themselves at yellow or black. So it's typically in the middle. And the questions are designed to actually challenge you. Some of the lower levels are pretty easy to score on. Some of the higher ones, some of the higher levels to give yourself 8, 9s, and 10s, much harder to do. So that brings us to the next section, which is building that foundation for data-driven decision making. What do we do? How do we do that? It's, again, opportune time to bring up the roadmap. So what you see here is a little bit more close-up yellow brick road that we talked about earlier. And you can see it starts with gather some data. Gather some data, come up with some metrics, put them together into a story, ideally to answer a question that the business had. For this organization, their journey started with turnover. They had relatively high turnover. They wanted to figure out what was happening. So they started gathering metrics and data and reported it. Unfortunately, they had some data errors and they lost credibility. So by the way, in this particular slide, when you're moving up and to the right, you're gaining credibility, gaining traction, getting more advanced, becoming that strategic partner. When you're moving down and to the right, you're losing credibility, losing traction, perhaps struggling to make progress the way you might like. So you can see, and the black language means they're moving up, the gray language means they're moving down and to the right. So you can see that their number one issue was data accuracy. So once they understood that, they had an understanding, they got an analytics mandate from top management, said, hey, I don't know if they could say we appreciate what you're doing, but they said, we want this done right. Get the resources you need. That's when a Center of Expertise, or Center of Excellence, COE, was formed. And they actually started doing some assessments, built some internal standards, completed some benchmarking so they had more frame of reference in terms of how good their data was and how they scored. And they came up with what we would call their first good metrics. Then they did what's called a study. So they included it all, came up with a much deeper and broader study, ideally trying to find the root cause of turnover, both good and bad. So what statistically correlated with higher turnover, what's statistically correlated with lower turnover. From that, they completed their study. Unfortunately, the historical data, because they used several years of data, the historical data was no good. So their new data that they cleaned and put standards in place was all accurate. Some of the old data was no good. So they actually had to go back and clean up a lot of old data, which meant literally going back to document old records in terms of hires and terms where their HR data perhaps had not been as accurate as it was. But once that was done, once they'd done the cleansing, they were actually ready to integrate databases to actually tell a better story. And by now, they were actually getting more traction across the organization, starting to do training and share the results of their process and their journey with other parts of the business. So they redid the study, came out with new numbers, presented it to management. What do you think happened? Unsurprisingly, management said, no way, they can't be right. Yes, that's what management often says when confronted by true facts and data. Not because that was the bias, but is in many cases it broke down or it disproved conceptual models that the management had. It basically broke down a myth or showed something that everyone thought was happening as a myth, or more of the rare exceptions to the majority of the case. And so that's why line management actually disagreed. So HR and analytics, being a good business partner, they said, okay, we'll go double and triple check the figures. They triple checked, double checked the figures, came back and said, sure enough, the numbers are right. What do you think management said to that? They said, oh, that's great. It took you too long. This process took too long. We could have used those answers months ago, maybe even a year ago. So that's a very backhanded compliment saying, congratulations, you helped me solve my problem. Now I wish I would have had your answers quite a while ago. But in a very nice way, actually, what happened was now that they'd achieved kind of the upper right area, they were now very much in demand for the organization. So then they, so to speak, showed up the following Monday and had a line of business leaders outside the area who were looking for help with some of their business-related issues that perhaps unsurprisingly had a human capital impact or a significant human capital component to them. So that's a true story based on the journey, and often some of the backhanded compliments that you get by achieving success in terms of dispelling old myths. So another part of a roadmap, another way to look at a roadmap is showing on a forward-looking basis. You may not have an ROI, but by the way, this particular case study related to a very large retail organization, and it did link to an actual ROI they had for several interventions, but they were just trying to build a business case to actually add staff to build up a center of excellence, center of expertise in terms of analytics, and they were doing it across several dimensions. One was talent. Another was basically systems and data, and the third was really the type of analysis they were going to do. There's a big distinction or differentiation between being able to do core reporting or coming up with some great metrics and reporting those via scorecard, reporting those via dashboard, reporting those via any means, and being able to use those in some sort of a statistical or correlative model or even a financial model that helps you show the value or impact of some of the changes that might be happening to the organization. And then also advanced technologies that might help make all of that process more automated, faster, and better. So all of that is why they had several of these drivers all going at different rates from 0 to basically 24 months to try to achieve that level of advancement. And by the way, without naming the organization, they were able to move the bar fairly well on 2 of the 4. The other 2, I think they still struggled with. So how else to show this analytics journey? Well, think of it as a house. And if you don't have a good foundation, the first time you get a storm, which aka big pushback from management, your house may not weather that storm very well. So build it on a foundation of good data, which by the way includes data standards. You don't have to use ISO standards necessarily. You can come up with your own, either industry linked or your own internal organizational standards. But one thing that is definitely a recipe for failure is having different areas of the business using the same metrics with different definitions or different metrics that overlap each other and come into conflict. So the idea is coming up with what are the right metrics. Let's standardize those throughout the organization and try to get from what we call the basement to the first floor to the upper floor of the house. The upper floor being workforce planning and analytics, which we see as two rooms of the same house. You're using a lot of the same data. In fact, analytics and planning uses almost identical data to do different things. But the workforce planning is very much projection and building a what if into the future based on a scenario. And the analytics itself is usually the study of the historical up to current data to identify what data really matters, what trends, what metrics really make a difference. And by the way, you could then understand, hopefully, or see that in fact doing great analytics tells you what metrics matter and what's really driven success or failure in the past. That leads to much better workforce planning. Either can be greatly successful all by itself, but the two of them together are really what lead to optimized business performance. And so the top part, basically the attic, rather than being the area where nobody wants to go, is the area where from an analytics standpoint everyone wants to go, which is the integration of talent into our business strategy and knowing what drives an impact and how we can model it better for an optimized future. So now we're going to talk about the value creation and examples from a principle standpoint. So how do we actually execute something like a simple HR scorecard? So there are actually a number of books out by, I think, Beatty and Huslid called the HR scorecard. There's also the workforce scorecard. So they have some great slides, and so we've attributed them for these particular slides and graphics, which is all really good because the whole idea is you want to go from basic HR data and systems to linking them to some sort of business outcome, which could be customer focused, it could be financially focused, it could be operationally focused. Ideally, you want to be able to figure out what are the metrics that will actually help drive success from a customer standpoint, a financial standpoint, operational standpoint, or even better, all of the above. In fact, great analytics and metrics can often lead to both lower cost and higher productivity at the same time. Yes, that's right. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can get better people that cost less and do more. Sound impossible? Not at all. In fact, that's what some great analytics companies are actually doing today. And they have far lower turnover rates, higher levels of performance than their peers. So what does that look like? Well, here's a bit of a story. Now, we could talk for a long time about this particular slide, and we may come back to it. In fact, we will. We're going to reference this slide additionally later. The real story here is what you see as a business strategy on the left, which every organization has. By the way, oftentimes even a small nonprofit has an organizational strategy. They might call it their vision statement. What are the key elements of that? So in this case, from a business strategy in a for-profit world, it's often something like return on invested capital or profitability, and then driven behind that, because you can see that they're related to each other, would be sales growth or market share growth or new product growth. And below that would be customer satisfaction. So if our customers don't like our products, we're probably not going to be able to sell as much, which wouldn't drive as much profitability or return to investors. And then at the bottom would be our workforce. We need a workforce that's going to help us delight the customer, that's going to be able to execute and achieve our sales growth and our overall mission and vision. So you can see that, in fact, these slides are connected. And what's usually missing from an organization is actually the workforce strategy. So the second column is what most organizations don't have. Some might call it a talent management strategy. That's fine. Very synonymous with the workforce strategy. And here, it's really based on a story around focusing on workforce productivity. And if you start at the top, we want better workforce productivity. We would need to be able to control costs. We can't just pay more to get more. And then they actually said talent operations, so we want to be able to optimize our talent, maybe our ability to build versus buy versus rent talent. And then, statistically model or understand where do we get our best people so that we can engage and retain them and recruit them right in the first place, which means building a talent pipeline. So that could be succession, that could be bench strength, that could be a lot of different things depending on your industry. But once you have those two columns, you're now ready to identify the third column, which is KPI metrics. What metrics will show us or prove to us that we're doing well in our workforce strategy, which in turn shows that we're doing well in our business strategy. And you can see some metrics that are identified here in terms of customer upsell rates, in terms of customer satisfaction scores, and in terms of customer training KPIs, meaning how much training are they getting. Once you have those, the last column is really HR. So each area of HR, each of the functional or sub-function groups in HR, what are they doing to help drive success for the business? By the way, when I was in HR, I ran compensation and benefits. I also had HR operations or systems for a couple of different organizations. And by one CEO's directive, my job as head of compensation was actually to control workforce costs, meaning we don't want to pay $1 more than market for most of our jobs. In fact, help me keep workforce costs from growing too quickly through a lot of rules and guidelines, meaning somebody's hired beyond a certain date, they don't get a salary increase. If they don't start until after this date, they don't get to be in the bonus program until the next year. Or they're not eligible for benefits until this date. So we had a lot of rules and guidelines that kind of slowed some of the benefits and compensation growth that enabled the organization to kind of keep the comp growth down. We also had very strict guidelines on hiring rules or hiring norms in terms of percentages of midpoint and upper and lower boundaries. So the head of recruiting, who also had a directive from the CEO, the same CEO, their job was to actually bring in the best possible talent. Do you think the two of us ever had a disagreement? Only every day. So the head of recruiting would often come in with some requisitions or some job offers and would say, here you go, head of comp, or Jeff, because we knew each other well. I'd look at him and say, oh, this is great. Unfortunately, we're paying outside of our salary range. Sorry, we can't approve that. Oh, this one has some sort of hiring bonus or relocation that's outside of our policies. Sorry, we can't approve that. So no, no, and no. And that's when the negotiation started. The head of recruiting would try to work to get them to say, hey, look, I can't get great people if I can't make some exceptions in our pay policies and practices. And my job as head of comp was to make sure we don't make any exceptions to pay policies and practices, because their job was bringing in great talent, mine was controlling costs. We were a bit in conflict, both rowing hard, but not in the same, not in sync and not in the same direction. So we're basically, as a part of HR, going in circles, not going downriver or upriver. How can we change that? Well, having this, a workforce strategy, linked to business strategy with the right kinds of metrics, the head of recruiting could come in and say, hey, I need to hire a training manager, or I need to hire a customer service manager, and I need to pay 20% over market for that. I would look at it and say, okay, wow, it's really critical to achieving our KPIs, our workforce strategy, our business strategy. That means I'm gonna improve it. I'm gonna get that money back somewhere else though. When you come in with a non-critical, less important role, maybe you're only gonna pay 85% of market, 90% of market, so I'm gonna get that back over time. And overall, I'm still gonna be able to achieve my goal of controlling workforce costs, but you, as the head of recruiting, are gonna be able to differentiate and be a little more surgical, because we now have this roadmap that actually shows how some of the things that we do in HR can link to or help us achieve KPIs, workforce strategy, and business strategy. So here's a perfect example, which is a challenge to conventional wisdom. Many organizations, in fact, when they have turnover issues, often the most common or first area that's focused on is compensation. Or in this case, commute distance. The CEO actually took an active interest in the high termination levels inside the organization, particularly voluntary turnover, looked at the exit interview data, and one of the top reasons cited in the exit interview data was that people said they found a job closer to home, they didn't like the commute, things along those lines. So there were several categories that basically boiled down to commute distance. And in fact, this being a fairly high density metropolitan area, many people who didn't live that far away and from a mile standpoint had very long commutes. So commute was definitely an issue, and the CEO had a simple solution. Let's not hire anyone who's more than 30 minutes from any of our offices. Unfortunately, if you're the head of the recruiting, you're ready to scalp your hair, pull your hair up, because you just went from having a national level of database or in terms of workforce to select from for recruiting to now a very, very small one, only people that are within 30 minutes of your facilities. In other words, if the organization is growing, you're probably not going to be able to supply the talent the organization needs. So now the organization, even through what would seem like illogical output or a logical intervention on the part of the CEO, would probably actually be worse off later on. So HR knew that, and actually that's what led to this particular study. So in this study, one of the things that was compared, and you can see basically the different bars across commute distance. The horizontal axis shows commute distance. First quartile basically being zero commute or very, very short commute, 5 minute commute. In fact, many of the people in the first quartile work from home. Fourth quartile, yes, people with 1, 2, 3 hour commutes, sometimes even more than that. So very, very long commutes. So you see what the trend from low to high commute distance, and then on the on the vertical axis, what you see is low, medium, and high turnover rates. And we segmented the workforce for different groups because what we found is workers actually react differently to different stimuli, meaning many of the groups that we showed here did tend to be moved together from a similarity standpoint, but they actually had fundamentally different rates of natural attrition and turnover, both voluntary, involuntary, and in total. And what you see here is you see grouping of high, medium, and low turnover groups. In this case, do you notice anything interesting about the chart? Which is, by the way, if two variables are correlated between vertical and horizontal axis, two variables, if something's correlated, you should see basically a straight line, positive correlation from lower left to upper right. You don't really see that here. You see that in a couple of elements of the line, but not overall in the line. In fact, if you were to combine all of the categories into one, what you would see is a smiley face. In fact, we called the chart, because we weren't very creative, it's the smiley face chart. So in fact, statistically, little to no predictive power in terms of commute distance and turnover rate. And that's not just for the group overall, that's for every job group. However, there was a sort of a silver lining or an element of truth to the CEO's interpretation looking at exit interview data. By the way, how many of you 100% believe your exit interview surveys? Most people don't lie, they just don't tell you the real reason why they leave. They give you they give you a reason, not the reason. So in this particular case, people that are low paid, so those that were paid below a certain level, some of the lowest paid, commute distance was actually a big factor, which if they think about it, cost of gas, cost of commuting, if they could find something closer to home, that would be a significant improvement in both income and probably quality of life for them. Those that were more highly paid, commute distance was at best a secondary or a tertiary factor. What really happened was there were other factors. For example, think of it this way. If you have a long commute, but you love your job, you love your coworkers, you love your career, you love the company or the brand or the culture, then the long commute's not a problem. But if let's say you hate your supervisor, you hate your coworkers, or you hate your future, the commute can be unbearable. So that secondary factor, it becomes very easy to cite when you ultimately do leave. And in fact, that was the case here. So the golden nugget was there was a relationship between commute distance and total compensation. So we're happy to give that information to the CEO and say, look, you were right, but it's really for only the lowest paid people. For everyone else, we certainly don't want to limit the pool of candidates to only people that live 30 minutes away from any of our facilities. And by the way, you might be surprised to know that in sharing this story, sharing the chart, sharing the data, showing the potential savings in terms of turnover, management was still on the move. They said, well, we don't quite see it. We still see some upticks in terms of lines for long commute distance. So that's when, by the way, it was time. Remember our 5 points for how to make a compelling business case. That's when we were ready for our qualitative story. We said, well, did you know that management, senior management specifically, has the longest average commute and the lowest overall turnover? And that's when management, the lights went on for the top managers. Said, oh, you're right. You mean that different groups react differently, and obviously senior management is an exception. We said, yes, of course they're an exception. And by the way, so were several other groups. So the last thing we want to do is put that tremendous limit on our recruiting for viable candidates to such a small circle of people that live with only 30 minutes. By the way, many managers actually lived out of state. They would fly in, train in, drive in, and had a temporary quarters, apartment, condo that they stayed at while they were working for the company, and they would go home on the weekends to their real home. So nobody had a longer commute with them. And jokingly, we even said, well, if you were to apply the standard, the 30-minute standard retroactively, most of senior management couldn't work for the company. And that's when they really got it. They're like, oh yeah, too harsh. Okay, so let's look at using that proactively for the lowest paid workers where we see that it's a factor, but let's not apply that. Try to arbitrarily do the one-shoe-size-fits-all for everybody, because that's just not going to work. All right, remember I was talking about compensation a minute ago. So by the way, this is the same company, and the only thing that was cited more frequently in exit interview data than commute distance as a reason to leave was compensation. And that is probably the most common reason why people complain about to HR when there's an attrition problem. A lot of managers will just come and say, you know, if we were paying better, we wouldn't lose all these people. Well, that's probably true in the grand scheme of things. If everyone was paid $1 million, they probably wouldn't leave, but then the company would, or the organization would be out of business or run out of funding. Oops. What's the reality? What's the truth? And where can you actually come up with both tactical and strategic insights? So take a look at this chart for a moment. Again, you see the same 7 categories of workforce. And what you see is compensation quartile. So people in the first quartile are paid way below market. People in the second quartile are paid about 75% of market. Third quartile about 105, 110% of market. And then fourth quartile can be 125, 150%, well above market. Actual market right in between the second and third quartile. So if you look at that chart, what do you see? Well, if you look carefully, you can see a different story looking at different lines, but overall, amazingly, they all start to move closer together after the second quartile. Basically, what we found is that beyond about 85% of market, turnover rates flatten out. So what we came up with, a story that was derived from this data and other data as well, was that as long as people are paid relatively close to market, compensation becomes a secondary or tertiary factor. Again, if you like your job, you like your prospects, you like the future of the company, you like the brand or the culture, you're more likely to stay there even if you're paid a little bit below market, because perhaps you have a bright future, or you have tremendous career growth, or the company's going to go public soon, or they're just on a big success track. Or you like your boss and coworkers. Couldn't be a lot of factors. Compensation, again, becomes more of that pain point when something else is also wrong. So management, actually, the same management didn't have any trouble understanding this one. They looked at it for a minute and they said, so what you're telling us is if we pay more, we won't necessarily get more retention. Absolutely, that's what we were saying. Remember, correlation between two metrics, both the horizontal and vertical axis, two different variables. If something is negatively correlated, meaning at the higher the compensation, the lower the turnover, what you should see is a straight line going from upper left to lower right. So what you should see is a straight line going down. And you don't see it going down to 0 for any of these groups. What you see is flattening out. In fact, strangely, at the highest level of compensation, you actually see some lines going up. What's that all about? What's happening there? Well, actually, some high performers, even when you paid them above market, you still couldn't keep them. Could that be a leadership factor? Could that be a brand factor? Could that be a career path factor? Absolutely. But based on compensation, that was not the factor. So in this case, the company said, okay, wow, so as long as we're paying relatively close to market, we're okay. There were 1 or 2 exceptions, like you could see customer service, of course, if you paid them higher, turnover rate dropped significantly. So if that was what's considered a critical job group, a critical workforce group, you could actually have a big impact in terms of bringing your attrition down by just paying a little bit more. Otherwise, probably you could get a lot of bang for the buck by utilizing other factors and not so much focusing on compensation. And by the way, the company, in their own engagement surveys and annual performance reviews, ask questions along the lines of, all in all, do you feel you're paid fairly for the work that you do? And the majority of employees actually said yes. So the exit interview data that said they left for compensation, by the way, what happened, in fact, was many people would get frustrated due to other factors like leadership, career path, which probably were they're taught to, other fact, lack of training, and then when they started looking, they found something that paid more. So when they leave on the exit interview, they say, oh, I found something that paid more. That didn't mean the true root cause, the source of the river or spring, was actually compensation. Quite the opposite. It was something much more downstream. So that concludes. Let's take a break at the power of combining data sources. All right, the power of combining data sources. So one of the pieces of magic of analytics is to study the entire talent management lifecycle. And that's exactly what most organizations do not do. They focus on turnover, they focus on engagement, they focus on training, they focus on recruiting or mobility. When in fact, just like the human body, we know that everything is interconnected. So if you're going to do an intervention in one, it might actually give some improvement, but it might create more problems in other areas of talent management. And there's a great story or case study coming up here that we can talk to you about called the power of combined data sources. So what you see in the graphic here is actually 6 different areas of talent management. Of course, you can slice them into more than that, but from an HCMI standpoint, we classify talent in 6 major categories in terms of recruiting, performance development, turnover, retention, compensation, and overall employee. By the way, you can argue there's actually a centerpiece here, which is called manager, or leader. But data from any of these can give you a tremendous amount of insight, help you with decision making, help you with root cause analysis. But again, ultimately, to answer the most complex questions, you pretty much have to combine data from different sources together to get a full picture. And the case study that we're going to talk about is actually a perfect example of that. And it's, again, one of the mea culpas in my journey as an analytics professional. So we were actually hired early on to do an analytics study for an organization that had relatively high attrition. And they wanted to figure out how they can improve their attrition, but they also had some secondary questions. One is really, where are we getting our best high performers? So what's our source of best hires? And also they wanted to know, what's our source of worst hires? Meaning, what source is it? Is it a university? Is there people coming to us from advertisements or specific recruiters that are most likely to leave? Basically, high turnover was sort of the source of failure, and high performance was sort of the definition for success. So we actually formed 2 teams to build databases separately early on in my career doing as an analytics professional. So we had team 1 working on performance performance and recruiting data, so combining those, and we had team 2 working on performance and turnover data. So what happened was team 1 actually came back looking at recruiting and performance data, and they said, we built a database, we crunched the numbers, and we found the solution. The most high performers that we're getting are coming from employee referrals. So our best source of hire in the recruiting side is employee referrals. Now, from a context standpoint, the company offered an incentive or a bonus for employee referrals to whoever gave the referrer, and also it was a program that was widely disseminated throughout the company, and there was no limit to the number of referral recommendations that an employee could get. So as a result, there are quite a few employees giving referrals. It was probably the number 1 or number 2 source of hire in the organization, and it was the source of the highest level of high performers. So great. And by the way, I was the analytics manager in charge of that project. Then team 2 came in. Team 2 came in and they said, we found the source, the worst source of hire, where the reason why most people leave. And we took a look at all the different sources, all the different data. We built our own database. And the worst source of hire is, drum roll please, employee referral. So I got the teams together, team 1 and team 2, and said, hey, you both came up with employee referral. One of you said it's great. The other one's basically saying it's terrible, meaning the more people we hire from employee referral, the higher our turnover rate's going to be. And the other team 1, saying the more people we hire from employee referral, the more high performers we're going to have. You both can't be right. combine your data and tell me who's right. Tell me what the real story is. So, quick quiz question for you. Who do you think was right and who do you think was wrong? More importantly, who was wrong? Well, some of you got the trick question aspect of that particular question. I was the only one wrong. They were both right. When they combined their data, they were actually both confirmed to be correct. Mathematically, statistically. However, I said, how can that be? It doesn't seem to make sense. Well, the real story was not the source of hire. The real story, the real golden nugget of value here was who was the referrer. So if the person giving the referral or the referrer was a high performer, there was quite literally almost a 50% probability that whoever they referred would also turn out to be a high performer. The old adage, great people know great people, actually statistically proved to be true in this case. On the other hand, because of the incentives the organization was offering for employer referrals, you had a lot of employees doing what we called the friends and family program. They were on the phone, actually almost like a side job, always looking for people they could refer in. And everyone who was hired was ultimately qualified for the job. So there were no unqualified referrals or hires that got through the screen. However, what happened is when you had a lot of people who all knew each other and worked together, who maybe not quite superstars, sort of normal or average performers, what we found was something very interesting. When one left, they all left. And because, again, we're not very creative, we called it the herd effect, meaning you lose one, you lose them all. Why? Well, if one finds a better job somewhere else or they get frustrated with something at the job, they tend to take all their friends and family with them. So that was really the source of a lot of the high turnover, high attrition that was coming from the employer referral program. The company had a difficult time. What do we do with that? And by the way, if you had never, this is the great parable, if you never combined your data, you would have never seen the true insight. Both of the analyses, both databases were correct. And if you had just used employee referral and performance level, you would have probably increased the incentive for employer referrals, which would have exacerbated your turnover problem, which would have been the wrong thing to do. Or if you didn't do that, if you'd done only the other study, you'd done the turnover rate linkage to recruiting source, you would have said, oh, wow, it's our source of most turnover. Let's cut all the incentives, which also would have been the wrong thing to do because you would have lost a lot of high performers who would have been joining the company. So the real insight was not the employer referral program itself as much as who is the referrer. The organization, in the end, was struggling with, wow, how do we get our high performers to refer more and how do we get our average performers to refer a little bit less? Because they didn't want to differentiate the incentives of the performance rewards. But they were trying to come up with creative ways, even almost internal ad campaigns, to get their high performers and superstars to refer a little bit more and their average performers to perhaps refer a little bit less. So that's one of the best stories I've ever seen about why it's so critical to combine your data, to be able to get the insights and the story out of it, because sometimes what you have is statistically correct, mathematically correct, but you don't have part of the story. You're looking at three puzzle pieces and trying to interpret the entire puzzle. You're trying to look. You've got the bug on the leaf, but what you don't see is the volcano erupting in the background. So you need to have more of that context. You need to combine more of your data sources to make sure that you really holistically and contextually are covering, think of human body, human health, all the aspects of human health. And if you're going to make one change or you find one thing that's correlated to another, that you're not somehow finding out that something else, when you make a change or an intervention, is going to break or be damaged. So ultimately, the story worked out really well for them in that they were able to reduce their overall attrition rate and maintain or keep as many high performers as they had been getting in the past. And so the ultimate solution was to target those high performers to get them to refer more. And now you have an exercise around the recruiting source analysis, which parallels some of our story and yet will give you some different outputs. So we encourage you to use the online materials that we have and the recruiting source analysis sample data for the exercise that we have to get your answers. I look forward to your feedback on that particular exercise.